Zethkri stared at the assignment tablet in his four-fingered hands, reading the words for the third time. The blue glow from the screen reflected off his large black eyes as he tried to understand why this particular task had landed on his desk. Around him, the intelligence division of the Galactic Confederation hummed with the quiet efficiency of 1,000 different species working together. The air recyclers whispered overhead, mixing atmospheric compounds suitable for dozens of different breathing systems. "Human warfare assessment," he muttered in his native tongue, then switched to standard Galactic as his supervisor approached. High Curator Vexitol moved with the fluid grace of his aquatic species, his translucent skin shifting colors as he communicated through both sound and bioluminescence. "You seem troubled, Analyst Zethkri," Vexitol said, his voice carrying the wet undertones of someone who breathed liquid as easily as gas. "This is a routine evaluation. The humans have requested membership in the Confederation, and per protocol, we must assess their military capabilities before granting full citizenship rights." Zethkri's antenna twitched, a sign of nervousness among his people. "But why assign this to me, High Curator? My expertise is in pattern analysis and strategic assessment. Surely a combat specialist would be more appropriate for evaluating a species' warfare methods." The older being's skin flickered with amused yellows and greens. "That is precisely why you are perfect for this assignment. The Keth-Moran neural structure is ideally suited for objective analysis. Your species has no emotional attachment to combat, no warrior traditions to cloud your judgment. You will observe, catalog, and report without bias." "What do we know about human military capabilities?" Zethkri asked, scrolling through the preliminary files on the tablet. The information seemed standard enough, a species that had achieved faster-than-light travel relatively recently, with technology levels comparable to most new Confederation applicants. "Very little, which is why this assessment is necessary," Vexitol replied. "Initial contact protocols show they have a unified world government and appear to have resolved their internal conflicts. Their technology is adequate but not exceptional. What is unusual is that they still employ biological soldiers in their military structure rather than relying entirely on automated systems." Zethkri found this mildly interesting but not particularly concerning. Several species maintained ceremonial or supplementary biological military units. "When do I depart?" "Immediately. Transport has been arranged to their primary military installation. You will observe training exercises, review tactical procedures, and assess their strategic capabilities. The humans have been informed of your arrival and have agreed to provide full cooperation." Vexitol paused, his skin shifting to more serious blues and purples. "They did mention that their warfare methods might seem unusual compared to other species, but I assured them that you would maintain proper scientific objectivity." 3. Days later, Zethkri found himself standing in what humans called a briefing room on their world. The gravity was slightly heavier than he preferred, and the atmosphere was thick with nitrogen and oxygen in proportions that required him to wear a breathing apparatus. The room itself was stark and functional, with chairs designed for the human, bipedal form arranged in neat rows facing a large display screen. 2 humans entered the room, both wearing identical olive-colored uniforms, covered in what appeared to be insignia denoting rank and specialization. The first was a male with graying hair and deep lines around his eyes, while the second was a female with auburn hair pulled back in a severe style. Both moved with a precise, controlled manner that Zethkri recognized as military bearing. "Welcome to Fort Hamilton, Analyst Zethkri," the male said, extending his hand in the human greeting gesture. "I am Colonel Jake Morrison, Base Commander. This is Major Lisa Carter, our Chief Strategic Planning Officer." Zethkri awkwardly attempted to reciprocate the handshake, noting the surprising firmness of the human grip. "I am honored by your cooperation, Colonel Morrison. I hope to complete my assessment with minimal disruption to your operations." Major Carter activated the display screen, which showed a complex timeline filled with dates, locations, and symbols. We have prepared a comprehensive overview of human military history and current doctrine. However, I should warn you that our approach to warfare may differ significantly from what you have observed in other species. How so? Zethkri asked, settling into a chair that had been modified for his anatomy. Colonel Morrison exchanged a glance with the Major before answering. Most species we have encountered through the Confederation seem to approach warfare as a mathematical problem. They calculate optimal outcomes, minimize losses, and engage in combat with predictable strategies based on resource allocation and technological advantages. That is the logical approach, Zethkri agreed. Warfare is ultimately about achieving strategic objectives with minimal expenditure of resources. That is where humans might seem unusual, Major Carter said carefully. We have a saying, the best laid plans survive until first contact with the enemy. Our military doctrine emphasizes adaptability, improvisation, and the ability to achieve objectives even when facing superior opposition. Zethkri made notes on his tablet. Interesting. Can you provide specific examples? The display screen changed to show a series of historical images. Humans in various types of armor and uniforms across different time periods, all engaged in combat. Human civilization has been in a state of almost continuous warfare for our entire recorded history, Colonel Morrison explained. We have fought wars over territory, resources, ideology, religion, and sometimes simply because diplomatic solutions seemed impossible. Continuous warfare? Zethkri repeated, his antenna twitching with surprise. That seems highly inefficient from a resource management perspective. Perhaps, Major Carter acknowledged, but it has also made us very, very good at it. The next image showed human soldiers in what appeared to be a training exercise. Zethkri watched as they moved through a simulated battlefield, noting their coordination and speed. What struck him as unusual was the way they seemed to respond instantly to changing conditions, altering their tactics without apparent communication or central command. You mentioned that you still use biological soldiers, Zethkri observed. Most advanced species have transitioned to fully automated military systems. Is this due to technological limitations? Colonel Morrison smiled, an expression that Zethkri had learned indicated either pleasure or irony in humans. Not exactly. We have automated systems, artificial intelligence, and robotic units. But we have found that biological soldiers possess certain advantages that cannot be replicated by machines, such as creativity, intuition, and the ability to make complex decisions under extreme stress, Major Carter replied. Human soldiers can adapt to completely novel situations, develop new tactics on the battlefield, and continue fighting effectively even when their equipment fails or their original mission parameters become irrelevant. Zethkri found this difficult to understand. But surely automated systems are more reliable, more predictable, and less prone to error. Reliability and predictability can be disadvantages in warfare, Colonel Morrison said. If your enemy can predict your actions, they can counter them. Human unpredictability has won us many battles that should have been impossible to win. The briefing continued for several more hours, with the humans explaining their military structure, training procedures, and basic tactical doctrines. Zethkri listened carefully, taking detailed notes and asking clarifying questions. Much of what they described seemed needlessly complex compared to the elegant mathematical approaches used by other species. As the session concluded, Major Carter stood and gathered her materials. Tomorrow, you will observe our soldiers in training exercises. I think you will find it educational. I look forward to it, Zethkri replied, though he felt a strange uneasiness he could not quite identify. Something in the way the humans spoke about warfare suggested depths he had not yet begun to understand. That evening, alone in his assigned quarters, Zethkri reviewed his notes and prepared his preliminary report. The humans seemed competent enough, with adequate technology and reasonable organizational structure. Their insistence on using biological soldiers was unusual but not necessarily concerning. Tomorrow would begin the real assessment of their capabilities. He had no idea what he was about to witness. The training ground stretched across several square kilometers of rough terrain, dotted with artificial obstacles, mock buildings, and sensor arrays that would monitor every aspect of the coming exercise. Zethkri stood beside General Sam Rodriguez on a raised observation platform, watching through specialized viewing equipment as two full companies of human soldiers prepared for what they called a force-on-force training scenario. The exercise is designed to test adaptive tactics under stress, General Rodriguez explained, adjusting his uniform cap against the morning sun. Blue team has superior numbers and defensive positions. Red team is outnumbered 2-1 and must assault a fortified objective. Zethkri made notes on his tablet. Standard numerical superiority exercise. The outcome should be predictable based on the force ratio and defensive advantages. Commander Amy Foster, who stood nearby monitoring communications, looked up from her equipment. That's what makes it interesting. We don't train for predictable outcomes. The exercise began with what appeared to be a conventional assault. Red team advanced in textbook formation, using cover and suppressive fire to approach the defended positions. Zethkri watched with growing confidence in his assessment. This was exactly what he expected from a reasonably competent military force. Organized, methodical, and following established tactical doctrine. Then everything changed. Staff Sergeant Rick Palmer's squad, part of the advancing Red team, suddenly found themselves cut off and surrounded when Blue team executed a flanking maneuver. According to everything Zethkri understood about military science, Palmer's unit should have either surrendered or attempted an organized retreat to minimize casualties. Instead, they did something that made no tactical sense whatsoever. Palmer split his 12-person squad into 4 groups of 3, with each group moving in a different direction. 2 groups continued the assault on the main objective, while the other 2 disappeared entirely from the sensor network. For nearly 10 minutes, Zethkri watched in confusion as Blue team tried to track and engage targets that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. "What is Staff Sergeant Palmer doing?" Zethkri asked. "He has divided his forces in the face of superior opposition. This violates basic tactical principles." General Rodriguez smiled. "Keep watching." Suddenly, explosions erupted behind Blue team's lines. Palmer's missing squads had somehow circled around undetected and were attacking the defenders from behind. At the same moment, the 2 groups that had continued the frontal assault launched a coordinated charge, catching Blue team between 2 forces. Within minutes, the defensive position was overrun. Blue team, despite their numerical superiority and defensive advantages, had been completely routed. "How is this possible?" Zethkri demanded. "The mathematics of the engagement clearly favored the defenders." "Mathematics don't account for human creativity," Commander Foster replied. "Palmer's people used the terrain, moved in ways that our sensors couldn't track effectively, and turned their apparent disadvantage into a trap for the enemy." The exercises continued throughout the day, and Zethkri witnessed tactic after tactic that defied conventional military wisdom. Captain Nicole Wright's company used deception and misdirection to convince a larger force that they were attacking from the north while actually approaching from the south. When questioned about her strategy afterward, Wright simply shrugged and said, "If they expect us to do the logical thing, we do the illogical thing instead." Lieutenant Ben Travis demonstrated what humans called battlefield improvisation when his unit's primary weapons malfunctioned during a critical assault. Instead of retreating to repair their equipment, Travis had his soldiers use training smoke grenades to create a diversion, then charge the enemy positions with backup weapons while the defenders were blinded. "Sometimes you have to break the rules to win," Travis explained to Zethkri afterward. "The enemy knows the rules too. If you only follow the rules, you become predictable." This concept of intentional unpredictability troubled Zethkri deeply. Every other species he had studied approached warfare as a science, with established principles and predictable outcomes based on known variables. The humans seemed to treat it as something closer to art, where creativity and intuition mattered, as much as technology and numbers. During the afternoon exercises, Zethkri observed something even more disturbing. A simulation required Red Team to defend a position against overwhelming odds. The scenario was designed to be unwinnable, intended to test how human units would conduct an orderly retreat under pressure. The humans never retreated. Instead, they adopted what they called defense in depth, falling back from position to position while inflicting maximum casualties on the advancing enemy. Each fallback was coordinated to draw the attackers into carefully prepared killing zones. By the time Blue Team finally overran the last defensive position, they had lost nearly 70% of their effective strength. But Red Team lost the objective, Zethkri pointed out to General Rodriguez. How can this be considered a successful defense? They accomplished their mission, the general replied. The objective was to delay the enemy advance and inflict maximum casualties. Mission accomplished. Even though they were defeated? There are different kinds of victory, Rodriguez said quietly. Sometimes you win by making the enemy pay such a high price for beating you that they cannot afford to win. That evening, Zethkri struggled to compose his daily report. How could he explain to his superiors that humans had somehow turned losing into a form of winning? How could he describe tactical doctrines that deliberately violated established military principles? The next morning brought new exercises that only deepened his confusion. He watched human units coordinate complex operations without apparent central command, adapting their strategies in real time as conditions changed. When communication systems were deliberately jammed during one exercise, the human soldiers continued to work together as if they could read each other's minds. How do they maintain coordination without communication? Zethkri asked Major Carter. Training, experience, and what we call mission-type orders, she replied. We train our people to understand the overall objective and then trust them to figure out how to achieve it. Every soldier from private to general is expected to be able to think independently and adapt to changing circumstances. This was perhaps the most alien concept Zethkri had encountered. In every other military he had studied, soldiers were expected to follow orders precisely and leave strategic thinking to their superiors. The idea of giving individual soldiers the authority to modify plans based on their own judgment seemed like a recipe for chaos. Yet somehow, it worked. The human soldiers demonstrated a level of tactical flexibility that was unlike anything in his previous experience. They could shift from offensive to defensive operations, change their entire approach to an objective, or develop completely new tactics, all within minutes of encountering unexpected conditions. By the end of his second day of observations, Zethkri realized that his preliminary assessment had been completely wrong. Human military capabilities could not be measured using conventional standards because humans did not fight conventional wars. They had developed an approach to warfare that was fundamentally different from every other species in the galaxy. As he prepared his evening report, one phrase kept running through his mind, something Lieutenant Travis had said during the day's exercises. The enemy gets a vote too. It had taken Zethkri hours to understand what this meant. Humans planned for their enemies to disrupt their plans. They expected the unexpected and prepared for their preparations to fail. Other species created detailed battle plans based on careful analysis and executed them with precision. Humans created flexible frameworks that could be modified or abandoned entirely if circumstances required it. They had built unpredictability into the very foundation of their military doctrine. Zethkri stared at his tablet, trying to find words to describe what he had witnessed. How do you explain chaos that somehow produces order? How do you analyze tactics that deliberately defy analysis? For the first time since receiving this assignment, he began to understand why High Curator Vextal had chosen him for this task. It was not because the Kethmaran were naturally analytical. It was because they were going to need every bit of analytical capability they possessed to understand what humanity truly represented. And Zethkri was beginning to suspect that what he had seen so far was only the beginning. Admiral Kate Phillips led Zethkri through the corridors of the Military History Archive, past walls lined with displays showing thousands of years of human conflict. The alien observer's antenna twitched constantly now, a nervous habit that had developed over his weeks of studying human warfare. Each new revelation had shaken his understanding of military science a little more. Today we will review historical combat footage, Admiral Phillips explained as they entered a secure viewing room. Command felt it would be valuable for you to understand how human military doctrine developed over time. The room was designed for extended analysis sessions with comfortable seating and advanced holographic display systems that could project three-dimensional battlefield recreations. Zethkri settled into his modified chair as the Admiral activated the first presentation. "We will begin with an event from our ancient history," she said. "The Battle of Thermopylae, fought approximately 2,500 years ago. The holographic display showed a narrow mountain pass with a small force of warriors in bronze armor and red cloaks positioned to block a much larger army. The numbers appeared on the screen: 300 Spartans against hundreds of thousands of Persian soldiers. "This is clearly an error in the historical records," Zethkri said immediately. "No rational commander would attempt to hold a position with such overwhelming numerical disadvantage." Admiral Phillips smiled grimly. "The records are accurate. King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans held this position for 3 days against, the entire Persian army." Zethkri watched in fascination and horror as the battle unfolded. The Spartans did not retreat when faced with impossible odds. They did not seek terms or attempt to negotiate. Instead, they fought with a ferocity that seemed to defy reason, using their superior training and the terrain to their advantage. Wave after wave of Persian attacks broke against their disciplined ranks, but they must have known they could not win, Zethkri protested. "They knew they would die," the Admiral corrected. "That was never in question. The question was how many enemies they could kill before they fell, and how much time they could buy for the rest of Greece to prepare its defenses. The battle ended, as mathematics dictated it must, with the Spartans overwhelmed and destroyed. But the cost to the Persians had been enormous, and the delay had allowed the Greek city-states to organize their resistance." "So they chose to die for no tactical advantage?" Zethkri asked. "They chose to die for strategic advantage," Admiral Phillips replied. "Sometimes the death of a few can save the lives of many. Sometimes a last stand becomes more powerful than any victory." The next historical presentation showed a battle from what humans called their Civil War. Lieutenant Colonel Alex Turner commanded a crucial position during the Battle of Gettysburg, where Union forces faced Confederate assault across open ground. Zethkri watched thousands of soldiers march directly into devastating fire, falling in enormous numbers but continuing to advance. The defenders, outnumbered and running low on ammunition, fixed bayonets and charged downhill into the attacking force. "This is madness," Zethkri whispered. "Both sides are acting irrationally. The attackers should have withdrawn when casualties became unsustainable. The defenders should have fallen back to more defensible positions. Yet the battle was won by the side that refused to give ground," Admiral Phillips pointed out. "Turner's men held because they believed their cause was worth dying for. The Confederate attack failed because their soldiers, brave as they were, finally reached the limits of what flesh and blood could endure." The presentations continued, showing battle after battle where human forces achieved victory through methods that violated every principle of rational warfare. At the D-Day landings, General Paul Mitchell's forces succeeded in establishing beachheads despite horrific casualties, simply because they kept coming. Soldiers fell by the thousands, but more. Soldiers took their places, advancing through gunfire and explosions with grim determination. How do you sustain morale in the face of such losses? Zethkri asked. Humans fight for more than just survival, the Admiral explained. We fight for ideas, for principles, for people we love. A soldier who believes his cause is just will continue. Fighting long after a purely rational analysis would dictate surrender. The most disturbing footage came from what humans called World War II. Admiral Phillips showed him examples of military leaders making decisions that sacrificed thousands of their own soldiers for strategic advantage. Cities were bombed despite civilian casualties. Entire armies were ordered to fight to the death to buy time for other operations. This seems like criminal waste of resources, Zethkri observed. War crimes by the standards of most species, the Admiral agreed. But effective strategy by human standards. We calculate acceptable losses differently than others. Every human soldier understands that their life might be the price of victory. Colonel Morrison joined them for the afternoon session, bringing additional footage that focused on individual acts of heroism that had changed the course of battles. They watched recordings of soldiers who single-handedly held defensive positions against overwhelming odds, buying precious time for their comrades to escape or regroup. This is Staff Sergeant Danny Cooper, Colonel Morrison explained as they watched a soldier continue fighting despite severe wounds. His unit was overrun during a fighting retreat. Cooper stayed behind with a heavy machine gun to cover the withdrawal. He held his position for 40 minutes against an entire enemy company. Zethkri watched in horrified fascination as the wounded soldier continued firing even as enemy forces closed in around him. Cooper fought until his ammunition was exhausted, then continued fighting with his sidearm and finally with his knife. He died at his post, but his sacrifice allowed his unit to escape and warning to reach friendly forces. He chose to die, rather, than retreat, Zethkri said quietly. He chose to die so others could live, Morrison corrected. That is the difference. The final presentation of the day showed human military doctrine regarding what they called acceptable losses. Admiral Phillips explained how human commanders regularly authorized operations with casualty rates that would be considered unthinkable by other species. We assess every military operation based on strategic value versus human cost, she said. If taking a position will save more lives in the long run, we will accept heavy casualties in the short term. The specific examples were staggering. Human forces had sustained casualty rates of 30, 40, even 50% in single operations, yet continued fighting until their objectives were achieved. Entire units had been effectively destroyed, accomplishing missions that other species would have declared impossible. But how do you replace such losses? Zethkri asked. We train more soldiers, Morrison replied simply. Human population and industrial capacity can sustain losses that would cripple smaller civilizations. We have learned to wage war with our entire society, not just our military. As the day's presentations concluded, Zethkri realized that his understanding of human warfare had undergone another fundamental shift. It was not just that humans fought differently than other species. They had created an entirely different philosophy of warfare, one based on principles that seemed alien to every other form of military thought in the galaxy. They had weaponized sacrifice itself. They had turned their biological fragility into a strategic advantage by making it clear that they would accept any level of casualties necessary to achieve their objectives. They did not just fight wars, they waged total war with their entire civilization committed to victory regardless of cost. Tomorrow, we will discuss contemporary human military doctrine, Admiral Phillips said as they prepared to leave the archive. I think you will find our current capabilities even more interesting. Zethkri spent that evening struggling to process what he had witnessed. He had been sent to assess human military capabilities, but he was beginning to realize that the question was not whether humans could fight effectively. The question was whether any species in the galaxy could survive fighting against them. In his daily report to High Curator Vextal, he tried to find words to describe the nature of human warfare. How do you explain a military philosophy based on willing sacrifice? How do you analyze tactics that depend on soldiers choosing death over retreat? His report that night was longer and more detailed than any he had written before. He documented the battles he had reviewed, the casualties humans were willing to accept, and the principles that guided their military thinking. But even as he wrote, he knew that his words could not fully convey what he had learned. Human warfare was not simply about defeating enemies. It was about demonstrating that humans would pay any price, accept any sacrifice, and endure any hardship rather than accept defeat. They had turned war into a contest of will, and they had spent thousands of years proving that their will was unbreakable. Zethkri realized with growing unease that tomorrow's session would show him how this ancient philosophy translated into modern military capability. If human historical warfare was this disturbing, what would their contemporary doctrine be like? Commander Steve Parker's unit moved through the simulated battlefield with deadly precision, their every action monitored by sensors that tracked heart rates, stress responses, and decision-making patterns under extreme pressure. Zethkri watched from the command center as the human soldiers faced scenario after scenario designed to test the limits of their tactical judgment and moral flexibility. This exercise simulates command decisions under impossible circumstances, explained General Linda Hayes, who stood beside Zethkri at the observation station. We call it the Kobayashi Maru scenario, named after an ancient training simulation. Every option leads to casualties. The question is, which casualties are acceptable? The first scenario placed Commander Parker's unit in a position where they had to choose between saving a group of wounded soldiers or preventing enemy forces from reaching a civilian population center. The mathematics were stark. Rescuing the wounded would require resources that would allow the enemy to reach the civilians, resulting in far greater casualties. Zethkri watched in growing horror as Parker made his decision without hesitation. Bravo team, maintain overwatch on the wounded. All other units intercept the enemy advance. Priority is civilian protection. He is abandoning his own soldiers, Zethkri whispered. He is making the hard choice, General Hayes replied. A commander who cannot sacrifice the few to save the many is not qualified to command. The exercise continued with increasingly difficult scenarios. Captain Helen Brooks faced a situation where enemy forces had taken position in a building containing friendly wounded. The only way to neutralize the threat was orbital bombardment that would kill everyone in the building, including her own people. Brooks authorized the strike. This would be considered a war crime by Confederation standards, Zethkri protested. By our standards, too, General Hayes acknowledged. But sometimes war crimes are necessary to prevent greater atrocities. Brooks saved the lives of thousands of civilians by sacrificing dozens of soldiers. History will judge whether she made the right choice. Sergeant First Class Tony Miller volunteered his squad for what was clearly a suicide mission: infiltrating an enemy command center to disable their communications before a major assault. The mission parameters showed a survival probability of less than 5%. Miller's response was immediate. When do we go, sir? The scenarios grew more extreme as the day progressed. Human commanders were tested on their willingness to use weapons of mass destruction, to sacrifice entire cities to save planets, to authorize operations that would result in the certain death of their subordinates. Each time, the human officers made their choices quickly and without apparent emotional distress. How do they maintain psychological stability while making such decisions? Zethkri asked. Training, conditioning, and absolute certainty in the righteousness of their cause, General Hayes replied. We select commanders who can function under extreme moral pressure and train them to compartmentalize their emotions. The afternoon session focused on what humans called asymmetric warfare. combat between forces of vastly different capabilities. Zethkri watched simulation after simulation, where human forces faced enemies with superior technology, greater numbers, or environmental advantages. The human response was always the same. They found ways to turn their weaknesses into strengths. When facing enemies with better armor, they developed tactics that targeted life support systems and mobility. When outnumbered, they used guerrilla warfare to multiply their effective strength. When technologically outmatched, they relied on unpredictability and human ingenuity to confuse and demoralize their opponents. "We have a saying," Colonel Morrison explained during a break in the exercises. "If you find yourself in a fair fight, your tactics are wrong. We do not seek fair fights. We seek overwhelming advantage through superior strategy." The most disturbing demonstration came when they showed Zethkri classified footage from human military exercises designed to simulate fighting against species with galactic-level technology. The scenarios assumed that human forces would be outmatched in every conventional measure: firepower, mobility, defensive capability, and numbers. The human response was terrifying in its thoroughness. They immediately began developing tactics to fight enemies they could not defeat in direct combat. They planned to use their own civilians as intelligence networks. They prepared to sacrifice their cities to deny resources to occupying forces. They developed weapons specifically designed to cause maximum psychological trauma to alien species with different neural structures. "You plan for defeat," Zethkri observed with growing alarm. "We plan for victory through any means necessary," Admiral Gary Sullivan corrected. "If conventional warfare fails, we wage unconventional warfare. If military resistance fails, we wage civilian resistance. If planetary resistance fails, we wage interstellar resistance." General Marie Collins showed Zethkri the most classified material of all: human contingency plans for fighting a war against the entire Galactic Confederation. The scenarios assumed that humanity would be massively outnumbered and outgunned, facing dozens of species with superior technology and resources. The human strategy was simple and terrifying. They would turn the galaxy's diversity against itself. "Different species have different weaknesses," General Collins explained. "The Altarians cannot function in high-gravity environments. The Zentaurans are vulnerable to certain frequency ranges. The Keth Moran, your own people, have difficulty processing rapid environmental changes." The plan detailed how human forces would exploit these weaknesses systematically, using biological weapons tailored to specific alien physiologies, psychological warfare designed to trigger species-specific phobias, and tactical approaches that would force different alien species to work against each other's strengths. "This is genocide planning," Zethkri said quietly. "This is survival planning," General Collins replied. "We hope it will never be necessary. But if humanity's existence is threatened, we will use every weapon at our disposal." The final demonstration of the day showed human soldiers in extreme combat situations, fighting while severely wounded or under conditions that should have incapacitated them. Zethkri watched footage of Marine Sergeant Carl Jensen, who continued, fighting for over an hour after sustaining injuries that should have been immediately fatal. "How is this possible?" Zethkri asked. "Human physiology responds to extreme stress by releasing chemicals that suppress pain and enhance performance," Major Peter Chen explained. "We call it adrenaline. It allows our soldiers to continue fighting long after their bodies should have shut down." The footage showed Jensen single-handedly holding off an entire enemy company while mortally wounded, buying time for his unit to evacuate. He fought with his rifle until his ammunition ran out, then with his sidearm, then with grenades, and finally with his bare hands. He died standing, still firing at the enemy with an empty weapon. He became more effective as he approached death, Zethkri observed with something approaching horror. "Humans often fight hardest when they have nothing left to lose," Chen replied. "We have weaponized our own mortality." That evening, Zethkri sat in his quarters, staring at his daily report, unable to find words for what he had witnessed. The humans had not just developed effective military tactics, they had created a philosophy of warfare that was fundamentally alien to every other species in the galaxy. They planned for scenarios that other species would consider unthinkable. They accepted casualties that would be considered genocidal by galactic standards. They developed weapons and tactics specifically designed to exploit the biological and psychological weaknesses of potential enemies. Most disturbing of all, they had built their entire military doctrine around the assumption that they would eventually face enemies who were superior to them in every measurable way. They did not plan to win through superior technology or overwhelming force. They planned to win through superior will and their willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. Zethkri realized that his original assessment had been completely wrong. The question was not whether humans could fight effectively against galactic civilization. The question was whether galactic civilization could survive if humans ever decided it was their enemy. His report that night was marked with the highest security classifications available to Confederation intelligence. He documented everything he had observed, every tactical doctrine he had witnessed, every strategic principle he had learned. But even as he wrote, he knew that his superiors would have difficulty believing what he was telling them. Human warfare was not just different from galactic norms. It was antithetical to everything the Confederation stood for. While other species fought for territory, resources, or political advantage, humans had developed the capability to fight for abstract concepts like freedom, justice, and survival itself. They had turned war into a form of total social mobilization, where every human civilian was a potential combatant and every human resource was a potential weapon. They fought not just with their military forces, but with their entire civilization, and they were prepared to sacrifice that civilization rather than accept defeat. Zethkri sat alone in the communications chamber, staring at the secure transmission array that would carry his final report across the galaxy to High Curator Vextal and the Confederation Council. His 4 weeks of observation were complete, and the weight of what he had learned pressed down on him like the heavy gravity of this human world. The final day had been the most disturbing of all. Admiral Gary Sullivan and General Marie Collins had provided him with access to humanity's most classified military planning. Their preparations for fighting wars against technologically superior civilizations. What he had seen would haunt him for the rest of his life. The humans had not simply developed tactics for fighting stronger enemies. They had created an entire strategic philosophy based on the assumption that they would eventually face threats that outmatched them in every conventional measure. Their response was to abandon conventional measures entirely. We call it the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, General Collins had explained, showing him simulations of human responses to various invasion scenarios. If an enemy seeks to destroy humanity, we will ensure that victory costs them everything they value. The simulations were terrifyingly thorough. Human forces would not simply resist invasion, they would turn their entire civilization into a weapon designed to inflict maximum damage on any conqueror. They had prepared biological weapons that could adapt to alien physiologies, psychological warfare programs that could exploit species-specific mental vulnerabilities, and scorched earth, tactics that would deny any invader the benefits of conquest. Even if you defeat us completely, you will wish you had never tried, Admiral Sullivan had said with quiet certainty. We will make victory so expensive that defeat would have been preferable. Major Peter Chen had shown him the most classified footage of all, human military exercises simulating resistance to occupation by multiple galactic civilizations simultaneously. The scenarios assumed that humanity would face a coalition of dozens of species with overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. The human response plan was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. They would use the galaxy's own diversity against it. Different species had different weaknesses, different fears, different biological vulnerabilities. Human forces would exploit these systematically turning allies against each other and making cooperation between different species impossible. The Confederation's greatest strength is its diversity, Chen had explained. But diversity also creates friction. We have studied every member species extensively. We know which ones have territorial disputes, which ones have incompatible physiologies, which ones have historical grievances. If we were forced to fight the entire Confederation, we would not try to defeat everyone at once. We would turn you against each other. The tactical manuals Chen had shown him detailed how human forces would use biological weapons against species with specific genetic markers, psychological warfare against species with particular mental structures, and environmental manipulation against species with specialized habitat requirements. They had planned for fighting wars that would last generations, with human populations bred and trained specifically for resistance activities. Most disturbing of all, they had prepared their entire civilian population for this possibility. Every human settlement had hidden weapons caches, communication networks, and supply depots designed to support guerrilla warfare for decades. Human children were educated about basic resistance tactics alongside their regular academic subjects. "You have militarized your entire civilization," Zethkri had observed with growing horror. "We have prepared our civilization for survival," General Collins had corrected. "Every human understands that our continued existence may someday depend on their willingness to fight and die for it." Now, as Zethkri prepared his final transmission, he struggled to find words that could convey the true nature of what he had discovered. His original mission had been to assess human military capabilities for a routine membership evaluation. Instead, he had uncovered a form of warfare that was alien to everything the Confederation represented. The humans did not simply have a military, they were a military, from their youngest children to their oldest civilians. They had spent their entire evolutionary history preparing for wars that other species could not even imagine. They had turned conflict into an art form and elevated warfare to a philosophical principle. His report would change everything. He knew this as certainly as he knew his own name. The Confederation Council would read his assessment and realize that they faced a choice that would define the future of galactic civilization. Humanity could be their greatest ally or their most dangerous enemy, but they could not remain neutral. Zethkri activated the transmission array and began dictating his report. He documented every training exercise he had observed, every tactical doctrine he had studied, every strategic principle he had learned. He described human willingness to accept casualties that would be considered genocidal by other species, their preparation for wars against technologically superior enemies, and their complete integration of civilian and military capabilities. But as his report neared completion, he realized that facts and statistics could not capture the true significance of what he had learned. The humans had not simply developed effective military tactics. They had created something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization that could wage total war without destroying itself in the process. Human warfare is not simply about achieving military objectives, he dictated into the transmission. Array. It is about demonstrating that humanity will accept any sacrifice, endure any hardship, and fight against any odds rather than accept defeat. They have turned their biological fragility into a strategic advantage by making it clear that they consider individual survival less important than species survival. He paused in his dictation, remembering something Admiral Sullivan had said during their final conversation. "We learned long ago that there are fates worse than death. Slavery is worse than death. Submission is worse than death. Loss of freedom is worse than death. We will choose death before we choose any of these." Zethkri resumed his report. "Human military doctrine is based on a simple principle that is alien to most galactic civilizations. They would rather die fighting than live in defeat. This is not merely rhetoric or propaganda. Their entire military structure, from basic training to strategic planning, is designed around this concept. The final section of his report dealt with recommendations for the Confederation Council. This was the most critical part, and Zethkri chose his words carefully. The decision made based on his report would affect the future of both humanity and galactic civilization. Humanity poses an unprecedented challenge to Confederation strategic planning, he dictated. Their military capabilities cannot be assessed using conventional metrics because they have fundamentally different objectives than other species. While most civilizations fight to achieve specific goals, humans fight to avoid unacceptable outcomes. This makes them extremely difficult to deter through conventional means. He paused again, remembering the countless hours of footage he had reviewed, the exercises he had observed, the conversations he had conducted with human military personnel. Every interaction had reinforced the same conclusion. Humans were unlike any other species in the galaxy, and underestimating them would be catastrophic. Based on my observations, I recommend that humanity be granted immediate full membership in the Confederation, with all associated privileges and protections. This recommendation is not based on humanitarian concerns or political considerations. It is based on strategic necessity. Zethkri took a deep breath before dictating his final paragraph, the words that would echo through Confederation intelligence circles for generations to come. Humanity should be granted membership not because they deserve it, but because we cannot afford to deny it to them. They have demonstrated the capability to wage total war against technologically superior enemies, using tactics that most civilizations cannot comprehend or counter. More importantly, they have shown that they will pay any price to preserve their independence, including the complete destruction of their own civilization if necessary. He paused one final time, then spoke the words that would become legendary in Confederation strategic analysis. They have turned the act of dying into a military strategy. I fear what they might accomplish if they decide that living is worth fighting for. The transmission completed, Zethkri sat back in his chair and stared at the now silent communication array. In a few hours, his report would reach the Confederation Council chambers, where the most powerful beings in the galaxy would read his assessment and make decisions that would shape the future of countless civilizations. He had been sent to observe human warfare. Instead, he had learned why peace with humanity was not just preferable, but essential for galactic survival. The humans had not requested Confederation membership because they needed protection or resources. They had requested it because they preferred cooperation to conquest.